Hey everyone, good to see this past Sunday, but still thought at the very least would like to finish Colossians. The numbers we see are kind of going down on the online stuff, but this format and what we could do going forward with it in terms of maybe even like small group stuff that we would organize. Or an online Bible class or whatever. So we're still toying with this stuff. And besides it, I don't want to just drop Colossians in the middle of it. I've read it enough times. I might as well complete the work here. I thought just to get us thinking, what do you think of when you see that? And well, it's a cabin. Not much of a cabin. It's looks to be about 10 by 12 maybe, so 100 square foot cabin that you might put up. And it reminds me of the houses of days gone by. You can drive past houses that 30 years ago or 40 years ago you remember and say, boy, those were new and beautiful houses and big houses and everything else like that. And now you drive by them and go, oh, that's an old small house. And how quickly you become discontent with something that you were very much content with before. Cabins aren't even cabins anymore. Boy, I grew up, my dad had a cabin, it was smaller than this. It was maybe 70 square feet. But we had a cabin, it was a big deal. And now cabins, I've been to some cabins that you look at, how is 3,800 square feet a cabin? It's got a 4-car garage and everything else. It seems a little bit more than what I remember a cabin to be. And that's not a judgment on having a nice cabin or a nice resort home or a second home or anything like that. But just you see how the progression of things through time, your idea of what is nice changes over time, and that really kind of gets to what's going on in Colossae and the view and relationship that they've had with the gospel and where it seemed to be trending, remembering what Paul's dealing with, false idea that there's something more than Christ, that we should be looking to other things, whether it's our human effort or maybe something a little more mystical or better than just Christ. That's what's going on there. Last week we looked at just the opening section, and remember to summarize that, Paul says, I don't know you, I pray for you, and I'm thankful for you that the gospel was preached to you by Epaphras, and all of the life of faith has been there as a result of it, as God has worked it. And he says, as an apostle, when hearing about you, I pray for you. And the things that I pray for you are that you would continue to have the things that you've had from the beginning, the growing in works and fruits of faith and the production of faith and the growing in knowledge concerning the will of God and the things of God. So faith, hope, and love being the important things that really are the end game and the end goal in our Christian life. And now this section before us that we'll look at, 15 to 23 of chapter 1, really, I think is the heart of the letter in a lot of ways. Just some thought questions here. Do we have parallels to what's going on in Colossae? And I think we do. I think just the belly gazing that goes on, or the desire that we're trying to make a church always bigger, always more, and something that outwardly seems and looks exciting and like, boy, if only we had this going on, then we'd be sure that God is active among us. And I think that lies within all of us. I think it's a confusion of maybe the desire for recognition by the world, by other churches, by whoever it is that we're really something. The confusion of that with maybe what is just God's pleasure with who we are that has nothing to do with these things. I think that lies within us, and for the last 30 or so years has probably been something the church has wrestled with at large, including in our circles too. I think that's not unique to have these struggles. Then you can look at other cults and things like that, like Mormons who go beyond the Bible to the Book of Mormon, as something more, and those types of things. Why do we want to content ourselves with the gospel? Why should that be it? Well, we'll leave it at that. And how do we deal with it? Because I think we all struggle with it. Maybe we leave church and we're hollow. I know even as a preacher, believe it or not, sometimes I leave and go, what a lousy sermon. Imagine if it's bad when you have to hear it. Imagine how bad it is when you got a lousy week and you preach a bad one. Church isn't, man, there's got to be more, or you didn't know any of the hymns, so it was difficult to sing, or I think within all of us lies this sinful desire for more, and it's there. How do you deal with it in our own hearts and our own lives, but also with those who maybe are teaching it falsely, or those we love that we're seeing this in, this sinful attraction to more in. I think Paul answers these things beautifully. We'll jump in, verse 15. This is a kind of a difficult section, or verse anyway. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So talking about Jesus, he says he's the image of the invisible God. And image there is just a word that stresses that has the same qualities of God. So he shares with God the qualities, and you might think of, Adam being created in the image of God. This is different. And again, if you dissect grammar and sentences, it doesn't say that the Son was born in the image of God, or the Son walked on the face of the earth in the image of God. It says he is the image of God. So there's a much stronger thing there than even Adam being created. In fact, what we'll get to in understanding through this section is what's being stressed is that Jesus actually is God. So the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. I just want to cover this because if you've ever tried to discuss with Jehovah's Witnesses anything, maybe you decide you're going to take on the challenge of trying to do what they're doing to you, to introduce Jesus and stress Jesus, and pray that God would use you to bring someone to faith from a cult. This verse will come up. Jehovah's Witnesses in their theology, Jesus is, he's the creator of this universe, but that doesn't mean that he isn't created at some point himself. And they'll come back and they'll point to this verse, the firstborn over all creation. And they'll talk about the firstborn being, my firstborn child is John. What do I mean by that? Well, he came first. So the firstborn of overall creation, they'll say, well, he was the first one that was created amongst all the things that are created, and then he became the creator of the things after that. And that's not what this word necessarily means. And firstborn, and it's going to become clear here just as a ranking thing. And I think of, I couldn't help. I'm a golfer, so I'm going to use the illustrations. Who are the greatest golfers of all time? Ben Hogan, Jack Nicklaus, Bobby Jones, Tiger Woods. And if you put Tiger Woods at the top of your list, that doesn't mean he was the first one in time. In fact, was the last one. But you would say he's the first on that list. And that's really kind of what is going on here, that in all these things and sitting over creation is the first one. And that doesn't really make sense, I guess, in some ways, and it might cause some confusion. Well, Paul isn't going to leave you there. In fact, he's going to explain it, and that's what that word "for" really is introducing. What do you mean by this, Paul? For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. That's one of the things that jumps out at me on the page. It comes through in the English and it comes through in the Greek as well, is this word all. Everything that is considered creation, which is all things apart from God. All things were, in him all things were created. Even things that you can't see and observe. Thrones, powers, rulers, authorities. This might, in fact, be kind of a hint at what is to come. If one of the ideas in Colossians is that God is unapproachable and therefore so disconnected from us, then we have to have medium through which to get to him. And Christ wasn't the medium, or at least there is a different medium that you have to go through angels who are a little closer, so they become intermediate. Maybe that's going on. It appears something like that is going on in Colossae. So maybe there's a hint here that says Christ is, in fact, over all these things, even these things that you're approaching to get to God, that Christ is head over him, and that's going to be relevant later on. He's before all things in time. And in him all things hold together. This adhesion. Paul in Athens preaching in the middle of that says here, some of your own poets even say, in him we move, or we live, we move, and we have our being. God is the one who holds all things together. So it's not just a creation, but how do things continue to hold together? Why don't they just fly apart? Who's got this all ordered and making sure that everything is doing what it is? Well, Christ is before all things, and he's the glue holding it all together. He's the head of the body. I don't think it's, you don't have to go any more deep than just saying, well, the head of the body, you cut off the head and the body dies. That's just what happens. He's the head of the body. What's the body? His church. Without him, the church falls apart. He's the beginning. He's the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. So even in terms of death and resurrection, who's the first? In rank and time and everything else? It's Jesus, even in death. So in everything, he is supreme. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile him to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So here is a stress again, the word fullness being, Paul had talked about that before, that you would be filled up, his prayer. You'd be filled up. But all the fullness of God being in who Christ is, and God's pleased with that. That was his pleasure and his will, that in Christ is God. For one reason, to reconcile all these things in all of creation back to himself. So there's a relationship. Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. He's supreme. There's nothing more that you can possibly want if you have him, which is what really Paul's argument is. There you have him over all creation. What does that mean to you? Once you were alienated from God, you were not reconciled. You were cut apart from him. Were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. I'm not as big a fan of the because there as I am something like this in reference to your evil behavior, or as you can tell by your evil behavior, you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds. The cause thing there seems to me to say that the cause of your mind being an enemy of God is your evil behavior. Well, that's not it. It's almost reverse of that. It comes from inside the man, the evil deeds, Jesus says. So I'd rather translate a little bit different in terms of the evil behavior is evidence of your alienation from God and of your evil head and your heart too, if you want to carry it that far. But now, so once, but now, he has reconciled you, like all things in all creation being reconciled. God has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. And that is a cool word there. Not only holy in God's eyes, in his plain sight, you're presented before him as holy. Without blemish actually would be the word that would be used for the Passover lamb, without blemish, and free from accusation, so that even Satan himself, the accuser, can't bring any charge legally against you. You've done nothing in God's eyes, in his sight. And that's what the reconciliation of the world and of you and of me by Christ to God means. As long as you, with the understanding that you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. The word picture there is really of a kind of a building of a house, that you have a solid foundation, you got a good solid house, and you don't move around, that you're not just flopping around, discontent with the foundation, the house you have here, and you're jumping here and jumping there, looking for this, want that, want this, want this. Just don't move from the hope held out in the gospel. And now Paul's going to transition at the end of this part into what his next part is going to be. It's going to be more personal in terms of his ministry and his work. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So the gospel's key in founding and building the faith and the hope and the love that is yours, that has reconciled you through Christ, which is the greatest thing as far as God is concerned, and it's obvious because he's created all things hold together in him. As long as you stay there, you don't lose that, and that's the gospel, and that's what Paul's work is. So cool section. Like I said, I think the heart of the letter, and it tells you a couple of things. When we want more and we're discontent, maybe the best thing we can do is review what we have. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Luther, I'm not sure. Sometimes pastors, I think, are really good at quoting Luther as the source of every good quote, and that's not necessarily the case. I think it might be Luther, but I'm not sure. But talk about how much better the world would be if we would, get up in the morning thankful for what we have and go to bed at night thankful for what we have. Media, I think, doesn't help. Just think of what an ad from Target or from some store does to you. It makes you discontent with what you have and makes you want more. And I think, that certainly is going on. It reveals, it's not the ad's fault, it just is a revealer of, what is going on in our own heart. And probably in terms of our faith is really, really, really good to consider and always go back and review the simple things. To see your sin for what it is, admit it, don't justify it and explain it away. See it, understand it, let it overwhelm you. How else do you appreciate what God has done for you for all that it is? Spend some time thinking about what hell would be, what it would be like to live apart from the one who created all things and sustains all things forever. Christ has won us from that. It's good to review that stuff and stay there, because that's what our hope is built on. That's where faith is solid and where love comes from. It truly is. The other thing that I think is fascinating when it comes to false teaching, how do you talk with your nephew? How do you talk with your neighbor? How do you talk with your co-worker, whoever it is that you're trying to present the gospel with? It is so natural to argue false points that come up, and to take them and dissect them and prove that what somebody might believe or say is wrong. And look what Paul does here. He gives glory to Christ and lets him stand as he does above all things. His glory and the wisdom of God and who Christ is just shines. And you don't have to dismantle the darkness after the floodlight is on. Let Christ stand and be positive in talking about what we believe, rather than negative in what somebody else believes. It's not just good argumenting, it's not just good construction of conversation, it's inspired. It's the way Paul dealt with it. It's the way St. John, that letter too is phenomenal, the way St. John dealt with it, and the false teaching in his time to just positively put forth the truth of who Christ is, and let Christ do what he does with it. It's up to him anyway. It gives glory to him and lets him be who he is, rather than me, can I argue it better. So those are a couple of good applications beyond just the stuff on the page there. Piece of artwork there, I thought it was kind of cool. It kind of, the whole idea of flowing together, and you get that vibe reading through this section. God who wants all things, was pleased with all his fullness living and dwelling in Christ, who created all things and holds all things together. This, God is just bigger than our ability to organize thoughts, and that kind of is the flow of the picture here. The cross, of course, in the very middle of it, through which all things reconcile to God in Christ. So close with that. Other than that, probably next week we'll get back with the next section, however long it may be.